The January air in Ciudad Juarez was bitter, but the real chill was the uncertainty gripping families near the Paso del Norte bridge. Wrapped in donated blankets, they stared at the silent border, once their hope, now a barrier. For weeks, their lives revolved around the CBP One app, their digital ticket to asylum. Suddenly, overnight the app failed. Error messages replaced appointments. Panic spread. Rumors swirled. A new US president, a system in chaos. No one knew what would happen next. They had followed every rule, waited months in shelters, believing in a fair process. Now the port of entry loomed as an impassable wall. US officers looked on, distant and unmoved. Their appointments vanished, leaving them stranded in limbo, resources dwindling, hope fading. The system hadn't just failed them, it had disappeared. On January 20th, 2025, just hours after taking office, President Trump signed an executive order that upended decades of U.S. immigration policy. The ink was barely dry on the inauguration before the new administration moved swiftly, signaling a dramatic shift in the nation's approach to its southern border. The world watched as the president, surrounded by advisors and cameras, made good on a campaign promise that had dominated headlines for months. Declaring a national security crisis, the order suspended all asylum processing at the southern border, immediately and completely. Border crossings that once bustled with families, workers, and hopeful asylum seekers fell silent overnight. The sense of urgency was palpable as officials scrambled to implement the sweeping directive. The legal framework for seeking protection in the U.S. was dismantled with a single signature. Years of established process and precedent were swept aside, leaving thousands of pending cases in limbo and legal experts stunned by the speed and scope of the change. The Department of Homeland Security was ordered to repel and remove anyone attempting to cross, even at legal entry points. Agents received new instructions overnight and the message was clear: no exceptions, no delays. The order cited an uncontrolled invasion, closing the door to asylum seekers entirely. For many, the hope of safety and a new life vanished in an instant, replaced by confusion and fear. This was not a tweak, but a total shutdown of the system. Processing centers that once handled thousands of cases each month now stood empty, their doors locked and lights off. Border agents were told to turn away all asylum seekers, and digital appointment systems were deactivated. The infrastructure built to manage migration flows was simply switched off, leaving people with nowhere to turn. The administration claimed executive authority in a crisis, setting up a clash with advocates and international law. Legal challenges began to mount, as human rights groups and immigration lawyers condemned the move as a violation of both U.S. and international obligations. The message was clear: the border was closed. The world's busiest land crossing had become a symbol of a new era, marked by barriers and uncertainty. For thousands, hope ended with a notification. In a single day, the promise of refuge was replaced by silence, leaving families stranded and futures uncertain. Before the shutdown, the Biden administration faced an unprecedented challenge at the southern border, as record numbers of migrants arrived seeking safety and opportunity. In response, the administration tried to balance humanitarian concerns with strict controls, aiming to manage the flow of people in a way that was both orderly and fair. The centerpiece of this approach was the CBP One app, which became the only legal way to request asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. Migrants, many fleeing violence or poverty, were required to use the app to schedule appointments, sometimes waiting months just for a chance to plead their case. The system, however, was plagued by technical issues. The app was slow, often crashed, and required reliable internet access, something many migrants lacked. Frustration grew as families struggled to navigate the process, but for those determined to follow the rules, it remained a narrow, official path forward. While waiting, migrants endured harsh conditions in crowded shelters and makeshift camps in Mexican border towns. They queued digitally and physically, holding on to hope that their patience and perseverance would eventually be rewarded by the system. The policy drew criticism from all sides. Some argued it was too restrictive, shutting out desperate people in need of protection. Others claimed it was too lenient, encouraging more migration and overwhelming border resources. Immigration activists, politicians, and the public debated its merits and flaws. Despite its imperfections, the system represented a compromise: strict enforcement against illegal crossings, but a legal door for those willing to wait and follow the rules. It was an attempt to bring order to a chaotic situation, while still upholding the right to seek asylum. The CBP One system, for all its faults, acknowledged the international right to seek asylum and provided a structured, if limited, process for those in need. it was a lifeline for many, even as it left others in limbo. On the eve of the new administration's inauguration, this digital pathway was the only option left for thousands of hopeful migrants, waiting in the dark for a chance at a new life. But with a single executive order, President Trump's administration didn't just alter the system, it erased it entirely, closing the door on the managed entry process overnight. The fragile framework that had offered hope and structure to so many was suddenly gone, leaving uncertainty and fear in its wake. The CBP One app was shut down instantly, without warning. Appointments that thousands of migrants had waited weeks or even months for simply vanished from their screens, leaving them in shock and disbelief. Migrants who had followed every rule, who had pinned their hopes on this digital lifeline, were left with nothing but uncertainty. Many had traveled long distances, risking everything, only to find the process they trusted had disappeared overnight. Families in border cities like Piedras Negras and Tijuana saw their hopes erased by a single notification. Parents struggled to explain to their children why their chance at safety was suddenly gone, and many broke down in tears. The digital queue dissolved, replaced by chaos and despair. Confusion spread quickly as word of the shutdown rippled through shelters and camps, and people rushed to the border, desperate for answers. Shelters overflowed as migrants, now with no legal path forward, became stranded in a dangerous limbo. Many were forced to sleep on floors or in the streets, exposed to the elements and growing threats. Mexican authorities and aid groups faced a sudden humanitarian crisis. Food, medicine, and shelter grew scarce. Volunteers worked around the clock, but resources quickly ran out as the number of stranded people surged. Vulnerable migrants became targets for cartels and traffickers. With nowhere safe to go, many faced extortion, violence, or were forced into dangerous situations just to survive. The system meant to provide safety now pushed people toward greater danger. Families hid in fear, uncertain if they would be able to protect their children from the growing risks around them. U.S. officials at the border, once prepared to process asylum seekers, were ordered to turn everyone away. The sense of hope that had once existed at the border crossings was replaced by frustration and heartbreak. The infrastructure for managed entry was rendered obsolete overnight. Processing centers stood empty, and the systems built to help people were now useless. At the bridges, desperate families pleaded with officers, holding up useless appointment confirmations. Their documents, once a symbol of hope, now meant nothing. The mission had changed, from processing to repelling. For thousands, the border had become an unyielding wall, and the future more uncertain than ever. Immigration experts and advocates condemned the shutdown as unprecedented. Andrew Seeley of the Migration Policy Institute called it a total closure of protection at the border. Legal challenges began immediately. The ACLU vowed to fight the order in court, calling it a betrayal of America's commitments. Humanitarian groups warned of a looming crisis in overcrowded shelters, predicting more dangerous crossings and deaths. Critics argued the policy conflated all migrants with security threats, ignoring the reality of people fleeing for their lives. They insisted a fair process was essential to American values and international law. The administration's rhetoric, they said, dehumanized the vulnerable to justify mass rejection. The legal battle over executive power and humanitarian principles had begun. The stakes were life and death for thousands. The border shutdown unfolded against a backdrop of political chaos in Washington. Just weeks earlier, Congress had failed to pass a crucial spending bill, triggering a partial government shutdown. Even with a Republican majority, deep divisions stalled funding for border enforcement and federal workers. President-elect Trump had urged passage, but hardliners blocked the bill, demanding stricter border measures. The shutdown disrupted pay for Border Patrol agents and created uncertainty for the incoming administration. The White House used this dysfunction to justify executive action, claiming Congress was incapable of securing the border. The political infighting set the stage for Trump's sweeping order. In the chaos of Congress, the border was closed by decree. The shutdown's true cost was human. Families who had risked everything were stranded in cartel-controlled towns, their dreams shattered. Parents struggled to explain to their children why safety was now out of reach. Aid workers described a mental health crisis. Hopelessness and fear replaced hope. U.S. border officials, trained to process and protect, now turned away desperate families, creating morale problems. The entire immigration system shifted to deterrence and removal, pulling resources from other duties. The shutdown didn't stop migration, it made the journey more dangerous. The border became a place of confrontation, not refuge. The stakes for migrants and officers had never been higher. President Trump's border shutdown was one of the most controversial immigration moves in modern history. The administration called it a bold step to restore order and sovereignty, halting asylum processing and sending a message of deterrence. Supporters saw it as a promise kept, a border secured. Critics saw only chaos, a humanitarian crisis, legal violations, and desperation on the other side of the wall. The last legal pathway for asylum was gone, replaced by confrontation and risk. Proponents argued it was a necessary shock to a broken system. Opponents called it a catastrophe and a betrayal of American ideals. The debate over security versus humanity remains unresolved. The border shutdown drew a line, not just on the map but in the heart of America's immigration debate.